Hello, good morning. Everybody hear me? So, 100 years ago, last month, July 1925, was the most publicized courtroom trial in American history. Does anybody know what it was? It's the second most publicized trial. Good guess. It was called the Scopes Monkey Trial. Has anyone seen Inherit the Wind? Old movie? Good, because it was terrible. So this trial was started by the American Civil Liberties Union. They wanted to challenge a law in Tennessee where public school teachers were forbidden to teach human evolution in schools and required to teach biblical creation. So they found a football coach who was willing to be a substitute teacher and teach evolution on purpose, get caught, go to court, so they could challenge it, bring it to the Supreme Court. The legal process itself was relatively uneventful. The man was found guilty, was fined $100, and the appeal process actually stopped because there was a technicality and they overturned the ruling on the technicality, so it never got to be appealed. So it didn't go to the Supreme Court, and the law stayed on the books for another 40 years. But what really had the lasting impact, and I think it still affects us to this day a great deal, is how all the publicity shaped how the public views Christianity and Christianity's relationship to science. So in a sense, the Christians had won the legal battle, but the evolutionists of the time had won the PR campaign, if you will. And to add to the stakes, the defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, called to the stand the prosecuting attorney, William Jennings Bryan, both celebrity attorneys in their own right, to the stand as a Bible expert and witness. And Darrow was drilling Bryan on his faith in the Bible. Do you really believe that God stopped the world for a day so that Josh could have more time fighting? Yes, I believe that. Don't you know that it would become a molten mass of matter? Well, I'd like to see expert testimony on that. Do you really believe that the whale swallowed Jonah? I believe in a God who can create a whale, a God who can create a man, and he can do with both whatever he pleases. And up until this point, the crowds were extremely supportive of Bryan's answers, calm, cool, and collected. But then in a dramatic moment, Darrow asks, do the words evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day, mean anything to you? And then Bryan answered, I don't think they need to mean a literal 24-hour day. But this was Darrow's trap. If those words didn't need to mean what they seem to plainly say, why should we teach them in schools? If the insider doesn't believe page 1, why would an outsider believe the rest of the Bible? If we can't be confident in Genesis 1, can we be confident in the resurrection? Now, I believe Bryan felt a pressure from the academic consensus of the time to reinterpret Genesis 1 with an old earth idea. And I feel for him because he didn't have the organizations that we do today, Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, or the individuals doing science from a Christian worldview who are doing amazing work. He did not have the advances in science. Every advance we have seems to point more and more to a creator and recent creation. So much has changed since Bryan's testimony. And I want to tell you that secular science, in spite of themselves, is building a heap of evidence that supports the Bible and supports recent six-day creation. And so why is this important? It's for us, right? If we are going to go up against anything in the West, Christianity is up against the secular atheist worldview. If we want to make advances in evangelism, we want to see a revival in our country, we want to teach our children the faith that they can confidently pass on to their children. I think it's by a revival in the young earth creation idea and of deep faith in Genesis 1 and being able to defend it articulately with good scientific evidence. Now, another thing, the trial made it popular that there is a conflict between science and the Bible, but it's a false conflict. There is no conflict, I'm arguing, and the science and the Bible go hand in hand. Europe is an interesting example of the fallout of an old earth belief. Europe is the birthplace of the vernacular Bible in our own language, right? It's the birthplace of Protestantism, personal Bible study, personal relationship with God, and the freedom of religion in many ways. But now, it's post-Christian. It's even anti-Christian. So what happened? I think it was that the old earth idea had so much pressure on the religious leaders that they embraced it and reinterpreted Genesis 1 to include an old earth, either with the gap between verse 1 and verse 3, or that 6 days could mean 6 long periods of time. That might have been comfortable for a generation of believers to hold on to both, the Bible and an old earth. But it didn't pass on to the generations very well. And so that's why I want to call attention to it. Some of you might already believe that the earth was created 6,000 years ago. Hopefully this is encouraging to you. Some of you might believe in the old earth. I invite you to hear me out and consider some things you might not be aware of. Some of you might be in between. I know of a woman, some of you might relate to this, truly believing the Bible deep in her soul. The Bible's true, Genesis is true, the resurrection is true, but everything she learned at school was evolution, old earth, old rocks, old stars. And so there's this tension between her soul and her mind. And when she heard these facts, she had the relief of being able to have her soul and her mind agree and rejoice in the truth of the Bible. So whether you're old earth, young earth, somewhere in between, I'm going to present a quick case from the Bible and from science itself that we have great reason to take Genesis 1 literally, that God created the earth 6 days recently, somewhere around 6,000 years ago. First, every time biblical authors refer back to Genesis 1, it assumes that it was 6 days in recent. So Jesus said, in the beginning, God created the male and female. It was in the beginning, right? Not a billion or a million years later. Exodus 20:11, the Sabbath command, for Yahweh created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh he rested. Were those real days? I think so. And then Paul in Romans 1 says, men since the beginning have perceived God's attributes and divine nature in the things that have been made. So men were at the beginning. And finally, the old earth view has death come into the world before sin does. But the Bible clearly teaches, Romans 5, that death entered the world because of Adam's sin. One man sinned, death entered the world through sin, and death spread to all men because all sinned. So that's the biblical case. Now, the fun part for me, as an engineer and a science nerd, I get to share you, I'm going to try to keep it down to 10, hopefully clear and easy to grasp evidences of a young earth. Does anyone remember the Miller-Urey experiment from high school? Yeah. So Miller-Urey in 1953 created amino acids in a lab by shooting lightning through ammonia. And they claimed victory because amino acids are the building blocks of life, and if they could make building blocks of life by lightning in a lab, then they didn't need a God. But what they didn't tell you is that hundreds of other compounds were also created at the same time, some toxic, some just unhelpful. There's no way that could have happened. And the experiment is actually out of favor today, but it's probably still in your textbooks. Then in 1958, Watson and Crick, after discovering the DNA molecule, do you guys know this story, Watson and Crick? Crick was a World War II code breaker, and after looking at the structure of DNA, posited that it's not the chemical itself, but the arrangement of the different nucleotides that carry information for our genetic, making proteins and all that. And he's celebrating that now they don't need a God. He filled in the God of the gaps argument. There's no gap. We don't need a God. But it's really interesting is because today, when we look at that, we say, where does information come from? If that's really a code, that means there's information. Where does information come from? 100% of the time, with no exception, information comes from a mind. And it wasn't my mind. There must be a God, right? So there's no proof there. Both of these actually favor a God. In 2005, a paleontologist named Mary Schweitzer discovered, you guys know this one? Say it. Yes, so in the femur of a T-Rex, she found collagen and blood vessels with some red blood cells still intact. And so she even said in the paper that she released this with, everything we know about compounds and decay and collagen, none of that should have been around 100,000 years, let alone 1 million, let alone 65 million. What does that tell you? Fossils are young and recent, right? And that discovery led to people re-examining fossils all over the world, and there's been hundreds and thousands of examples of re-examined fossils with the same soft tissues that shouldn't be there, right? But if we believe in Noah's flood, God's recent creation, that makes perfect sense. It's really blowing the lid off of what we know about fossils, right? Everybody says they're millions or billions of years old, and they point to a old Earth, but on the contrary. 2018, this one didn't get nearly enough coverage. Rockefeller Institute did an enormous DNA study. They took mitochondrial DNA because that's in common for all eukaryotes. They all have mitochondria, and mitochondria has its own DNA. So they compared something like 200,000 species, 5 million individuals. They were looking to prove a descendancy, the big family tree. What they discovered was, I quote, species are islands in sequence space. That means in all the sequences of DNA you could have, each species is way off on its own. There's nothing around it. There's no descendancy. And what's more is that the variation within each species proved that the species themselves are younger than 200,000 years old. So modern science is, whether they like it or not, really pointing to a recent special creation. Now, there's some fun ones you can just look up at the sky at night. The sun, or the moon, both. The sun is getting hotter, which means that in the past, it was cooler, right? And secular consensus is that the Earth is 4 billion years ago, or 4.5 billion years ago, and life started 4 billion years ago. But 4 billion years ago, the sun was so faint that the Earth would have been an ice ball. So the evidence in the sky to them is totally undermining the fact that life could have started at all 4 billion years ago. This is called the faint young sun paradox. And then the moon is leaving us. Did you guys know this? 1 inch a year, which means in the past it was closer. So if you wind it back millions of years, the moon was actually so close that the gravity of the Earth would have shredded the moon and wiped it like Saturn's rings, and caused asteroids to hit the Earth, the size of half of a moon, and destroyed any life that was on the Earth. So the only explanation they have, it's really an anomaly. The moon was placed there recently. There is no alternative explanation. It's amazing. The oceans are are simultaneously too salty and not salty enough. Every year the rivers wash salt into the ocean, and there's no way to get the salt back out, right? Have you guys ever been to the Dead Sea or Mona Lake in Mammoth? So if we rewind that back millions of years at the same rate, the ocean should be too salty to support life. But it obviously can. And the best fit of the data we have is that the ocean was placed there clean recently, and that Noah's flood washed all the salt that is currently in the ocean into the ocean. It's a perfect match. And then finally, the biggest two arguments that we see against young Earth creationism are distant starlight and radiometric dating. Now, in 2021, we launched the James Webb Telescope, and we wanted to look deeper into space than we ever had, farther into space than we ever had. And apparently they caught galaxies that are 12 billion light years away. And it blew their minds. They had to rethink everything they knew about galaxy formation because they were already mature. They were fully formed galaxies 12 billion light years away, which couldn't have happened according to their paradigm. But if God placed them there maturely and brought the starlight to us, it's a non sequitur. It's not a surprise, right? Also, we see that there are 8 stars in the galaxy dying every year. It's a nova or a supernova. But we've never witnessed a star birth, a star formation. We should see at least 8 a year, otherwise there'd be no stars left 12 billion years later, right? So the James Webb Telescope is actually proving that the starlight problem is really their problem because stars exist and galaxies are mature, just like the Bible says. God placed them there in the night sky for us to see. Radiometric dating, it's not just carbon that you might have heard about, but they also use lead, uranium, plutonium, strontium, all these other compounds, compare their ratios, and then conclude a date on that. And then they assert this is an absolute date, it's precise. But the problem with that is that the assumptions that are required to make a conclusion include what the starting amount was. But how could anyone know what the starting amount was on those mixtures? So that is wrong. They have to prove their assumptions, and they haven't. The second is if we have rocks of known ages, like a volcano, new rocks coming out of a volcanic eruption, they should match what the radiometric dating methods would say they are, right? Every time this is tested, it's false. It's wrong. It's way off. So they have a 0 win record on known dates. And finally, if there's any radiometric carbon at all, radiocarbon decays way faster than all these other compounds. It should be totally gone in 100,000 years. But every time we test a fossil within an old rock, or a diamond within an old rock, or a coal bed within an old rock, these carbon-rich compounds, there's always radiocarbon present, which means all these old rocks that we think are old are less than 100,000 years old, which means God placed the carbon there recently, and Noah's flood is what buried them in the rocks. So, in my view, I think the science is clear. The scientific data is clear. We can interpret it in a way that supports the Bible, and in my view, screams and rejoices with the Bible. That we can have faith in Genesis 1, a literal 6-day creation recently, that the old earth is out the window. And why is this important? Again, because if the earth is young, if it can be shown to be young, then there must be a God. If you're talking with a colleague who doesn't believe in the Bible and thinks it's full of fairy tales, and you show them all this information, there must be a God, right? If there is no alternative because the science is pointing to a young earth, they can't say there is no God. We can have faith and confidence in the biblical creation story, and therefore we can have faith and confidence in the resurrection of Jesus, which follows that creation story, right? We can send our children off to college equipped and ready to defend their faith and look that professor in the eye and say, no, I have really good reasons to believe what I believe. We can send them off to Europe to be missionaries, to revitalize a dead faith there and say, no, you guys, remember Genesis 1, we are created specially in God's image. And that is something I think we all would agree is worth sharing. So looking back at the Scopes trial, 100 years later, a history of scientific challenges and scrutiny, but Christianity has met all the challenges, has survived all the scrutiny, and is holding its head high. The Bible is trustworthy. The scientific consensus has given a lot away in our direction, and the momentum is shifting. So we are losing the legal battles today. Almost all the court cases involving Christianity or ideas of Christianity are being shot down. But the PR campaign, the momentum has shifted. We are in a fun time to live as Christians because we have the scientific data is on our side. So just want to encourage you, have faith in your Bible, believe God's word, and teach it to your children, teach it to your friends. You can have confidence in it. Thank you.